Let's go back to Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, former ambassador to Malta, president of the Middle East Policy Council. Ambassador, you've been sticking with us all evening as we've been discussing the various aspects of these U.S. strikes on Iran-backed groups in Syria and Iraq. And I just want to get your take on some of what we heard Ross Atkins, our analysis editor, speaking about there, namely the challenge for the U.S. of going after these various groups that may not entirely be acting according to Iran's wishes.
That is exactly right. This is classic asymmetric warfare. We do have overwhelming firepower and military strength, and it is likely to be of limited utility when you have not set pieces to bomb and to degrade, where they might be very mobile, where their calculations of loss and gains are very different from our calculations, how we define it. And that is the classic definition of asymmetric warfare. So there's that. There's also, as we heard from some of your earlier commentators about the back channels via Iraq, of the Iranians saying that they did not have direct control over this specific attack, that then we would want to be careful about not escalating. If the Iranians were not intent on this attack to, cost us human life, then we want to be careful as well. I'd also note, I think Barbara Starr made a very good point earlier, but that the delay in carrying out this strike, of announcing that we were going to do it, although I think the announcement wasn't necessary, everyone would expect that, would also allow for very limited civilian casualties. And that is important to the United States. We see what is happening in the Gaza Strip. So any calls for the United States to take the gloves off or to hit Iran proper, we have to recognize that there is a political motive behind a lot of that nothing the president does is going to be sufficient for some people, and that the American people are not interested in war with Iran. So I think these are important points to keep in mind, and to keep the context and the calls for greater military engagement with Iran in this frame, that this is a political call, and that it's not something that would benefit the United States. We can see in the Gaza Strip, the Israelis certainly have no gloves on at all. And even after 3 months, they have not been able to get anywhere close to their definition or anyone else's definition of victory.
Yeah, Ambassador, we've been hearing from our correspondent in Baghdad that there have been communications with both Iraq and Iran as well, as before these strikes were carried out. As a former ambassador, can you give us an idea of diplomatically what would have been happening over this past week leading up to these strikes, as the U.S., as the White House, President Biden was preparing for these to be carried out?
Yeah, well, certainly for any back channel communications, the embassies would have been involved. Sometimes it goes directly to capitals, but passing, meetings and passing those messages and making sure they get to the right ears. That's one thing. As the president looks at a response to something like this, where American lives have been lost, you can absolutely count on he would have been presented an array of options of what to strike, with excellent analysis of what the impact of it would be, what the likely responses to them would be, whether it would be a short-term or longer-term gain, and a clear recognition that it had to be strong enough that hopefully it might deter. And we will see in the coming days, or perhaps longer than the coming days, because Iran may be very upset with its proxies for taking American life and putting it in danger. So maybe they've turned off the spigot. But the reality is that these groups will have weapons in store, so we won't know if they decide to carry out an additional attack. It may not at all be that Iran has okayed it or green-lit it. It is that they are acting independently of Iran. So the president would have had those arrays presented to him, the pros and cons hashed out, and make his decision, and then the military will carry it out.
And Ambassador, you said Americans don't want a war in the Middle East at the moment. We've heard a few analysts say at the same time, it's not entirely clear if the U.S. has already been pulled into a broader conflict with the strikes that we've seen from Houthi militia on also U.S. commercial vessels, and of course the strike on the U.S. base in Jordan, killing 3 American soldiers. Is the U.S. already caught up in what is a wider conflict?
Yeah. Well, I would say that we are certainly involved in the conflict. And from the beginning, the president had been clear that that was not his wish, not his desire. And the efforts from Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, the head of the CIA, our special representative for hostage affairs, all of these efforts to minimize this conflict, to find a way forward, and certainly to keep us out of it. There is a definite political cost for the president if we are sucked into this war. So I am certain every effort is being made to minimize it. And again, it goes back to getting a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, that now is extremely important to the United States, not just for the Palestinian terrible loss of life. And we should not lose sight of that. This is one of those things where we are focused on this, and yet the conflict in Gaza is ongoing. We have to keep that in mind because that's the core. That is the core issue right now with all the dangers that are current in the region.
And Ambassador, just one more question. We haven't talked about U.S. allies in the region, like Jordan. What role do you think allies will be playing in the coming days?
So we have been working with our allies and partners in the region. They have been very clear of their desire for a ceasefire for the last several months. But also working with us. We recognize the importance of getting hostages released, of getting Palestinian prisoners released, and that was the deal that was made. And I really want your audience to keep in mind all the hostage releases have come from diplomacy, not bombing, not attacks. Diplomacy is what is going to work to get those hostages. And indeed, any Palestinians that Hamas is trying to get released. So that is really important to keep in mind. We're working with our partners. This is very difficult, but the relationships are good in the region with the United States and Jordan and Egypt and our partners in the Gulf as well.
Right.
We're staying focused on that, and I'm sure that we're working very closely to get a deal done that gets a ceasefire.
Ambassador, it's been so good to get your perspective, your experience, of course, on this story on our show tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.